That was
Hey.
cool.
Yeah.
Hello.
Cool. Yeah.
The music intro, I hadn't heard that before. Hello and welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour with me, Brandon Tessers, and him, Cecil.
And then a mysterious,
Cecil
effective
Ellison.
artistry spirit up in the corner.
Yeah.
It's me. I'm Sarah. I'm changing it.
No worries.
Welcome. This is the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I'm Brandon. I'm a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy. We say that for a lot of reasons, one being it's public Q&A, and it is an open conversation. So any of you who are here at any point, if you'd like to ask any questions or say anything, we're watching the chat. Feel free to chime in at any point. The theme of today's episode is anxiety. That's what we're intending to start by talking about. That doesn't mean that any questions or comments from the chat have to be within that parameter. Anxiety, whatever you want to talk about here is what we're going to talk about, but we just pick a theme so that we can kind of collect and prepare some questions ahead of time and have something to start off on. We are Effective Artistry. We provide individual and group therapy, as well as individual and group executive functioning coaching. And we have some very specialized groups that we're excited about. In a few weeks, we'll be starting our first Dungeons and Dragons narrative therapy, social skill development, and executive functioning training program. Yeah.
Technically,
Did I miss anything, Cecil?
It's the group narrative therapy program thingy that utilizing Dungeons and Dragons. But
right.
It's not like
centered around
utilizing them, not that they're endorsing it or any of that fun stuff. It's just it's an incredible game that is provide a lot of things. See, let me be super specific.
Good. See, careful and precise in language. That's good. So welcome. We're going to talk today about anxiety, and right off the top, as I usually like to do, I just want to talk about what anxiety is really quickly. And then we'll take questions and do kind of specific things, specific suggestions of exercises or potential approaches to change your experiences with anxiety if the way that you're experiencing it is different from the way that you want to experience it, which presumably is why you're here. And I want to remind everybody that general answers or general questions get general answers and specific questions get specific answers. And general is great because it applies in many, many cases, more frequently, but it's less impactful in each case to which it applies. Whereas specific applies in fewer cases, but is more impactful in the cases in which it applies. So keep that in mind as you're asking questions. So anxiety is a big one. Cecil, talk about anxiety while I take a sip of tea.
Oh yeah, that's not a difficult thing at all, right? That does not make me anxious. I don't know. Anxiety seems like one of those words like lazy, like it's just a catch-all. It's I don't know.
It is a pretty broad term. It has a lot of different specific applications, and it's part of the reason that this word is so troubling, because it describes an experience that a person has, but every person's own individual experience of anxiety is different to some extent. It's a word that we use to talk about a disorder, condition, predisposition to that experience, so that you are more likely to experience anxiety more frequently, more intensely, for longer duration, more disproportionate to the specifics of the situation. It's also a word that we just use sometimes to mean I'm thinking about something in the future and it's bothering me slightly, or all different kinds of things. So as with everything, all of those definitions are valid. It's about how you use it. Sometimes the problems caused in communication around this topic is because one person is using the word anxiety to mean one thing, and the other person is using the word anxiety to mean a completely different thing, or a pretty close but slightly different thing, and things get lost in translation. So what we're going to do is add a way of defining anxiety that I have found most useful, most helpful in my work with clients and with myself, which is not to undercut or take away from any of those other definitions. They're all valid. But what we're always looking for is utility, not accuracy. I'm never saying that something that's not useful is therefore inaccurate. It could be 100% accurate. We've all been in that situation where it's like, if I could just blank, then I would feel better. And that might be a completely accurate understanding. But if you can't get yourself to blank, then it's not very useful. So we want to add more options to expand those possible utilities. So here's how I find it useful to define anxiety. There is a gap between two things. One is how important it is to you that something go a certain way. The other is how confident you are that that thing will go that way. The larger that gap is between those two things, the greater your anxiety. That gap is what we call anxiety. And I find it useful to talk about it in those terms because it gives us more variables to look at, as opposed to a definition of anxiety that's talking about it just in terms of like a biopsychological reaction to things. Excuse me. Because then it's just about modifying your reaction, whereas really there's two kind of ways that we can approach this, either or and both together, of doing things that increase your confidence that the thing will go the way you want it to go, or doing things that decrease the level of importance that you're putting on the thing going the way you want it to go. And the specifics will change from situation to situation.
Hey, Brendan, can you, because I want to make a banner of this, what did you say about anxiety? It's like there's two things.
Anxiety is the gap between how important it is to you that a thing go a certain way and how confident you are that that thing will go that way. And I use the word thing a lot. You know, what I'm talking about is down to the details of the specifics, that it may be, because it's all ultimately subjective, right? It's arbitrary. It's how you define it. So I may be anxious because it's very important to me that I pay my bills at the end of the month, right? Or it might be important to me that I pay my bills at the end of the month and have $500 left over, or that I pay my bills at the end of the month, but I actually pay them a week before they're due. It's completely up to the individual person's perception, because anxiety ultimately is about perception. That doesn't mean that it's not real. It is real. It's a physiological, or at least there's a physiological component to it, but it's the construct that we're talking about. The term anxiety, the construct that we use, applies to real situation, but it doesn't map 100% perfectly to the actual experience. It's kind of a compression of it. No matter who you are, if you have anxiety every day, one time of having anxiety is not exactly the same as the next time that you have anxiety. There's going to be a lot of things that are similar or even the same, but there will be different things too. So looping all that in and calling it anxiety, as with everything, we want to be able to get more granular, look at more specifics, just enough to be able to resolve the problem. You don't need to get into like the total complexity, because we can't. It's infinitely complex. But if it's not going the way we want it to, we can look at that next level of complexity to open up more options, more variables, more things to observe and change and see if it works the way that you want it to work.
I think it's cool, like breaking down anxiety and the idea of it's not just like, oh, this one thing, oh, I have anxiety and stuff. It's almost like music. Like, what does music mean? It's like, well, are you talking about the notes? Are you talking about like this type of music? Are you talking about like the structure? Like, what does that mean? And all those little, bringing anxiety down to that. It's like, oh, anxiety is like, it's just like a little note making this beautiful symphony of the daily struggle.
I like to use, I don't know why, but I like to use the word fire to make this point, that like, even if we do agree in all the ways that matter, so that it enables us to move forward, because that's the point of communication, right? Is that you and I can be close enough in our understandings that it doesn't cause problems. We don't need to know exactly the same. So if I say the word fire, it's important to have that language, because otherwise, how do I communicate this to you at all? You know, unless I build a fire. If I describe it, I'm just using other words for it. But when I say the word fire, what you think and what I think are two different things. You might be thinking of a campfire, and I might be thinking of a forest fire or a candle fire, right? So then I can get more specific with that language, and I can say what I'm talking about is the fire at the end of a candle. And that might get us close enough that whatever the issue is at hand, why we're communicating about this thing, we're able to move forward on. But still, your experience, your connotations, your visualization of that fire at the end of a candle is going to be different than mine. It's just likely close enough to not cause us a problem in this instance. You know, this hypothetical instance. So that's where we're going to start, is with that definition of anxiety, the gap between how important it is to you that something go a certain way and how confident you are that that thing will go that way. And either of those things can be out of whack with reality, right? Like it might be, as an example, if I see a cucumber out of the corner of my eye and don't quite recognize it and panic and jump away because I think it might be a snake, well then, you know, what was really important to me in that moment was not getting bitten by a snake, and my confidence level was not very high because for a moment I thought there was a snake there, and I thought it was a very realistic possibility that I'd get bitten by a snake. So I jumped away to increase my confidence that I'm not going to get bitten by that snake. And then I see it and realize it's a cucumber, and now I can go back close to it because, again, I'm pretty confident now that I'm not going to be getting bitten by a snake when it's a cucumber. So it's not to say that these things are absolutely proportionate to the reality of what's happening. They can get twisted, but sometimes they are absolutely proportionate. So we can't just say it's all in your head either. Like if there is actually a rattlesnake right here staring at me and my anxiety shoots through the roof, yeah, I'm really anxious, but for good reason, because I am accurately understanding that the chances of me getting bit by this snake are pretty high, and I need to change that. So it's never one thing or the other.
I mean, also snake bites are like not that. I mean, don't get me wrong, no one should get bit by a snake, but they're not really.
Well, that's a great point. I didn't expect that response to this analogy. I thought it was relatively universal.
But just because like people demonize
point.
Snakes, and they're an incredible creature, and they contribute a lot to the ecosystems. So
well, because the point that you're making right there is that even though you don't have necessarily more personal experience with being bitten by a snake than I do, because of research that you've done, things that you've learned from other people through books or conversations or whatever, your way of thinking about it is different than mine. So if you and I were both faced with the same situation, my anxiety level would be higher than yours, because I don't actually really care about being bitten by a snake. I care about the pain and the death and whatever behind it. And your confidence that you will not die is higher because you think snakes are less dangerous than I do in my like less educated and aware. And I shouldn't use the word educated because I don't. Well, I don't know exactly what you meant then. I thought you're. Oh, well, okay, but that doesn't affect if there's a snake right here. Who cares how common it is? It's right here.
Okay. I mean, rattlesnakes in Texas are no joke. Just don't mess with them.
Yeah, I've seen a good amount of them in Utah too.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right, so let's do some questions about anxiety. Is feeling socially awkward a form of anxiety, thinking that people talk behind your back to avoid contact? So, yes, absolutely. But again, and thank you for the question, we could define it in different ways, right? So there is actually a term in the DSM of social anxiety, right? So we have, defined that diagnostic criteria category. So yes, this absolutely fits under this. And of course, as I said before, we can define it in different ways. It's about keeping going until you find a way to define it that enables you to interact with it and change it, observe it, understand it in the way that you want. So yes, this is absolutely a form of anxiety. Other frameworks that people talk about this in, we've talked in the past about rejection sensitivity dysphoria, highly sensitive person, empath. Depending on the specifics of the situation, people might call it paranoia or even delusional paranoia, depending on how out of touch or out of proportion it gets with the reality. But yeah, so what you're really fearing there, because anxiety is always rooted in that future projection, right? Because it doesn't actually, and this is a great point. Let's assume that you think people are talking about behind your back and you're feeling very anxious about it when they're not actually doing so. So again, it reinforces that it's not about what's actually happening. It's about your confidence in projecting into the future. So what you're worried about in this case then is either, what if the next time I talk to these people, they act as though I'm awesome and I believe them, but really they're talking behind my back. That means I'm being fooled socially. That means I'm saying things that people don't like, or I'm being coddled or being told that certain ideas that I have are valuable when they're not really. Or maybe it means that I'm worried that they won't contact me at all or won't support me, or that they're playing some kind of long form trick on me. Or maybe it's not about them at all. It's just about me and my social ability in general. That if these people are talking behind my back, what does that say about my ability to talk to and relate to anyone? So avoiding contact absolutely is one way to avoid that anxiety. People will talk about avoidance as though it's inherently bad, and it's not. I can avoid the anxiety of I might get bitten by a snake by not being around a snake. Is that a bad thing to do? It can be, it can be that it takes so much from you. It costs you so much in terms of time and energy, or even just opportunities that you're giving up, that it's not worth that. Although obviously in the moment you think it is, otherwise you wouldn't avoid it in the first place. But if you want to change it, you got to come back to that root. What is it that I am worried about going in a particular way? And are there other ways to get it besides avoiding the contact? So in other words, you're very concerned in this case. Yeah, the snake is not in your school every day. Exactly. So it's a lot less costly for me to avoid snakes than it is to avoid social contact. Absolutely. So in this case, if you're avoiding contact because of that social anxiety, what you're saying is that there's some possibility in that interaction that if it were to go that way, I would hate it. It would be painful to me. And I don't want that to happen. So one way to make sure that that doesn't happen is to not engage at all. But there are other ways to increase your confidence that that won't happen, right? That you won't get bitten by the snake. 1,000 scenarios. Yeah. And a lot of times that's what ends up happening is your brain then is running these scenarios, trying to find ways to increase the confidence level that I can make things go the way that I want them to go. What if they say this? Well, then I could say that. But if I say this, what if they misinterpret it that way? And yeah, I experienced this too. This is why sometimes it takes me an hour to write a 2-sentence email because I'm like, ooh, what if they interpret this in that way, even though that's not what I intend? I better refine that. You know, when you rehearse those conversations in your head. So sometimes that's beneficial because you are actually exploring scenarios and increasing your skill and confidence that you can manage the situation. Sometimes it's not because you're putting time and energy into it and it's not actually increasing your confidence, or it's increasing it at such a low rate that it's not really gonna, it's not worth how much you're putting into it, right? So that's why these solutions, they matter specifically. So you got to think about, who is it that you're worried is talking behind your back? What is it that you are worried will happen if they are talking behind your back? Is it about how they're going to interact with you? Is it about what it means about you and other future scenarios? Is it about you need something from them that you're not getting? And then start to explore other specifics about how you can get those things. Here's an exercise is, if you're feeling anxious, rank those two variables. Scale of 0 to 100 is what I always default to, but do whatever works for you, right? So how important is it to me so I got to identify, what is it? What is the thing that I'm worried might happen or might not happen or whatever? Once I identify it, how important is it to me that it goes that way? 0 to 100. 100 being like, I will die, literally die. Because often the brain goes to that scenario, that death, this might be related or unrelated. I don't know if we'll talk more about this today, but the less you know about a situation, the more your brain is going to default to saying, I might die. Because that's the brain's job, is to keep itself alive, right?
Or in some people's cases, like, death is not the worst thing to happen. So they're far.
Well, that is true. Absolutely. And like, as with everything, there's always exceptions. But as a general default, the survival instinct is built in. Other things can overpower that, certainly. But as a general rule of thumb, the brain considers death the worst option. But obviously, like with everything, there are exceptions. And one being like, yeah, I want that to happen, but really I could care less about whether it does or not. And then saying, what's my confidence level? So this is just a general exercise that helps you get a sense of where that gap is. And then you ask yourself questions. Start with confidence, because that's usually the easier one to make changes to. Ask, what is it that I can do that will make that number go up? What can I do right now that will make me more confident? Again, it doesn't really matter if it actually bears out in reality, right? That I might be nervous that I'm going to accidentally, I don't know, punch somebody in the face. I don't know. The likelihood of that happening is very low because it's never happened. It's not likely to happen. But, I can increase my confidence by, taking dance lessons and increasing my control over my own body, right? So that I feel more aware of my body and space and more in control of it. So I might become more confident, even though the actual odds didn't really change that much. So that's a generic one, but if you start there, it'll help you start to identify some specifics. Cool. And this we've got this other question here too from a little while ago. How can I know if my anxiety is severe or not? Is there a good barometer for that, given everyone's relationship to anxiety is so different? That's a really great question, and it's very connected to what we were just talking about. And the answer is not going to be satisfying. The answer is that nobody can know your level of anxiety other than you, and that there's not a lot of value by which I mean utility, usefulness, in ranking your anxiety against other people's anxiety. You know, we can't really, there's no observable metric to compare against. You know, if I want to know if I'm taller than you, there's something we can observe and both agree on. But anxiety is a very subjective experience. Yours is different than another person's. And how are we ever going to be able to rank whose is worse? There are symptoms of anxiety that we can measure and compare. Certainly, you know, if somebody is experiencing X, Y, and Z that we call a panic attack, we can measure how many, you know, how frequently they're experiencing panic attacks, how long those panic attacks last, how much does their heart rate or breathing change. But people have different symptomatic expressions. Some people's anxiety doesn't manifest in panic attacks where others do. So just because one person's having a panic attack and another does not mean that they're experiencing more anxiety. I know that's not a very satisfying answer, but the bigger truth, I think the more valuable thing behind it is what this is you can't look externally. I can't give you a way to determine whether or not your anxiety is severe. It is subjective. And we get into a lot of trouble with these kinds of things because people will say, oh, everybody experiences that. And then the other person says, no, you're not experiencing what I'm experiencing, because if you were, you wouldn't be doing what you're doing. And it's an argument over who's correct about the other person's experience, which again, I don't find a lot of utility in. I like connection. I like sharing experiences for us to be able to connect and support and feel like we can relate to each other. But to debate about who's got it worse, you know, we talk about the oppression Olympics, right? Like, maybe let's focus on the oppressors rather than which one of us is feeling worse by it. Again, not that there's not a truth and a reality there, but it's all filtered through perception and ultimately not a very useful way to spend our resources, our time and energy, as opposed to going after the problem. So you need to determine whether it's severe or not. And that's where developing language, like creating a scale like we just talked about, can help you, because you're comparing it against your own experience. So yeah, you do want to be able to compare, I felt this level of anxiety yesterday, today I'm feeling this level of anxiety. It's more. If we keep it at a binary level of I'm experiencing anxiety or I'm not, well, then that doesn't give us a lot of nuance. And it doesn't mean that we can't deal with the anxiety, but it means that any scenarios, any strategies, whatever that we come up with that we think might help with the anxiety, they have to help so much that it takes us from the binary of anxious to not anxious. Because otherwise, if it's anxious to less anxious, but we don't have a way to observe and remember that, then whatever it is we're doing, which again, every task takes resources, we're putting resources into that strategy, pretty quickly we're going to say, yeah, that's not working. I'm still anxious because I'm not aware of the fact that I'm a little less anxious. And not that it's, you know, that you have to focus on small little steps, but the options expand, and small steps are going to be a lot easier to find and easier to implement than big impactful steps. So develop your own scale. Again, I'm always big on a word and a number rating scale, but visuals work for some people really well. You know, use emojis, draw a sketch that means something to you. It could be unique every time. Every time you experience anxiety, sketch out what you're feeling in whatever way makes sense and keep it in a book so that you can go back and reference and remember, oh yeah, I remember. So comparing this to that is different, better or worse or whatever. And then you'll put your line for what severe is, meaning when it's past this level. So we can talk more about this as we go on in specifics, that we always want to talk about a toolbox, right? That you have as many options as possible for how to address it, whether it's anxiety or anything else. And I like to have people create menus. So you can create a list of, okay, doing this mindfulness exercise helps me to reduce my anxiety. Doing this thing before a big day at work helps prevent me from getting anxiety in general. Because most of people's existing like strategies for things are to cope with the anxiety once it arrives. We want to help prevent it so you don't have to deal with it when it arrives, but better to be able to cope with it and deal with it than not, for sure. And then you can divide that menu into, okay, here's the menu of things that I do when it's like mild, and here's the menu of things that I do when it's severe. And so you start to learn and develop that language of, oh, I'm experiencing severe anxiety right now. I better do the things that I need to do when it's severe. Does that make sense, Cecil?
Yeah. So I'll look at that. So you talk about like building this barometer, the system for yourself, but like, and again, we talked earlier about like anxiety being this catch-all term. It's kind of like fire. Like, what really does that mean? So we have this barometer of like, I feel this or that. Is it helpful then to like break those down into different like aspects of anxiety, of like work anxiety, social anxiety, or whatever like realms were pulled in that way? I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense, and absolutely, it can be helpful to break it down. And again, same deal as much, but getting into the complexity involves work, right? Involves expending resources. So you get as much into the complexity as you need to in order to solve the problem. So if I can just label it anxiety and make it that binary thing, and for whatever reason, whatever confluence of factors internally, externally, that enables me to do what I need to do to make it so that I'm anxious at a frequency that I'm okay with, and at a level and an intensity and a duration that I'm okay with, cool, I'm done. I don't need to think about anxiety anymore.
Yeah. How's it feel to be God's chosen?
If not, I go more into it. And so, yeah, one way to do that is to break it down into different types of anxiety. When I experience social anxiety, I know that I can do this and this and this. Or before a social experience, I can do this and this in order to prevent myself from getting to a place where I'm feeling anxious about it. Or before whatever, it doesn't have to be a social experience. Whereas professional anxiety, I do these things. And, body anxiety, I do these things. And so as granular as you need to get in order to be able to make it so that you can interact with it. Another way to make it more specific is to create a scale of approaching anxiety, meaning not just what level of anxiety am I experiencing or what type of anxiety am I currently experiencing, and therefore what do I do, but in terms of, okay, I've created a scale now that's 1 to 10, and 10 is when I call it anxiety. So now I start looking at, first I start by observing, especially by asking people around me too, because they might be aware of things that I'm not aware of. That when I'm at a 1, which means not totally restful, not totally calm, but not anxious either, but moving in that direction, what are the things that I can observe that tell me that I'm at a 1 as I approach this thing? And then what are the things that I can do when I'm at a 1 to bring me back down to a 0? And same for 2 or 3, all the way up. So I've had clients, you create this, chart, right? An Excel spreadsheet or whatever of 0 to 10. And then pick something that you do when you start to get more stressed or anxious or whatever words you want to define. I start to grind my teeth. Okay. So when you notice yourself grinding your teeth, where would you put yourself on this scale? Like full on anxiety? Is that what you're going to call it? Or you could call every level, level 1 anxiety, level 2 anxiety, whatever terminology you want. When I'm grinding my teeth, that's like a 4. It's like I still, can have more control, more ability to kind of step back. It's easier to get myself back to a kind of neutral and calm state. But I've definitely, escalated in some way. All right, what's something else you notice? Sometimes I start to pick at my hair, pull hair out. Okay, and when that's happening, what level are you at? So you start to put those signs paired to those levels. And then again, okay, when it's that bad, what are things that you can do? And go ahead.
So when you're like getting close to approaching anxiety and you start to like notice these things, how do you prevent, like, so let's say you're like really close to anxiety, and so you're just kind of like in that like, fight or flight mode, we talked about before, like that, either going to shut down, overwhelmed, whatever. When you look back on it and go, okay, cool, what was it that led up to that? How do you keep from like going in that whole realm of like, let me analyze this and, get in your head and be like, oh, it's because of this, and I tie it to this and that, and then just kind of like get watered down by that intellectualism opposed to like the actual things that like you can see and engage with, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good question. So here's some terminology that I use, but again, different people use different ones. I find this useful. I talk about observation versus analysis. Observation meaning things that I can confirm are happening, and I try to like open it up because my subjective experience of anxiety, I would still call that observation. I'm observing that I am in this moment anxious, even though it's not something that objectively other people can look at and say. I like to call it subjective empiricism because it sounds fun to me. So observation is about what is happening, even if I'm using constructs and language to define that. Analysis is when I start to get into what is it that led to this happening, or what changes could I make to prevent this from happening again. So experiencing anxiety, that's observation. Getting into, I think I was experiencing anxiety because, is analysis. And both of those things are useful, but you want to use them in concert with each other.
Being able to say that last part again.
So that both of those things are useful, but you want to use them in concert with each other.
Right before that, like how did there's like a simple way of determining between observation and analysis.
Oh, observation is what is happening. And you can still say what happened, when the moment has passed, but you're keeping it limited to what you observed happening, even though that can be through subjective experience. Analysis is when you're getting into why you think it happened, what led to it. And this is not about whether analysis is accurate or not. Different people have different abilities to be accurate in their analysis. It's about whether that analysis is useful. Because the scenario you were just painting, Cecil, and we've all been there, is I'm going back and analyzing why I think I got so anxious. But whatever path I'm going down, even if it's an accurate understanding of what led to that anxiety, is not useful to me. Meaning I'm understanding it to be things that are outside of my control, or things that even though they're theoretically within my control, I can't, at will make those changes. So that's not useful to me. And that puts me in a state where I'm now saying, okay, well, now I figured out why it's happening, but there's nothing I can do about it. So now I'm doomed to just repeat this forever. And that in and of itself is now causing anxiety, because I don't want to be anxious, or I wouldn't be doing this analysis in the first place if I was comfortable with the level of my anxiety. But the analysis that I've come up with doesn't allow me to make those changes that I want to make. So it's important to me that it changes in whatever way I want it to be, but my confidence that it will change is still pretty low. Are you overthinking then? Yeah, that's one way, that's one terminology to use, that at a certain point, analysis, there's two different ways that I think analysis becomes unhelpful. One is the one I was just saying, where I've come up with an analysis that may or may not actually be accurate, but isn't useful. But because I've come up with that analysis that I believe is accurate, whether or not it actually is, I stop my search. Meaning there are thousands of different ways to accurately describe a thing, accurately analyze a thing, right? But I've settled on one, the first one that I found, or the one that seems most valid to me, and then concluded that there's nothing I can do about it. So I stopped my search. I'm not looking for a new analysis that enables me to do something. The silly metaphor I always use is, if I approach a door and I think it's a push, but really it's a pull, then I go to push it and it doesn't work. And the first reaction I'm going to have is to try and push it again. Because I already, as I approached the door, noticed some features about it, did analysis, and said, in order to get through that door, which is what I want to do, I got to push it. And so I tried, it didn't work, and I tried again. And I can keep pushing for 3 days and it's not going to hurt me. And again, it's accurate. If I were able to push the door open, I would get through, but I'm not able to push the door open. So as quickly as I can, I want to be able to move to a place where I say, okay, pushing the door theoretically would work, but it's not working. So let me let go of that analysis, even if it's accurate, and start looking for the next solution. Well, what if I try pulling it? Let me see that. And then it works and I can move through. So that's one way in which analysis can be harmful, is we lock on to one and stop doing more. The other is when we do analysis and come up with an idea of what we think might be helpful, because that's what analysis is about, right? We're looking back to analyze what happened, but with the intent of being able to change something so that the future is different in the way that we want it to be. So the other way that analysis can be problematic is I have arrived at my best guess about what's happening and what I could change to be different, but I'm not confident that that's correct, right? So, for example, I think that if I get some new clothes for the job that I've been doing where I feel uncomfortable, and if I wear those new clothes, then I will feel more confident and comfortable because I'll feel like I fit in better there. That's my theory. But I think about it, I'm like, I'm not totally sold on that. So what if it's not? Like, I don't want to go spend money on new clothes when I'm not sure that that's going to solve the problem. I think it might, but I'm not sure that it will, so I don't want to take that step yet. Here's the model that I use for this part of overthinking is at that point, you have the idea to beat, meaning the best idea you could come up with at this point with the knowledge, the information you have is buy some new clothes that make you look differently and therefore you might feel differently. You don't have to act on the idea to beat, but thinking more without new information is not going to help you come up with a new idea. If you think of it in terms of like taking the SAT, right? When you read the 5 answer choices, your gut, your first answer is going to be, I think it's B, but maybe it's C, maybe it's D. And the more time you spend with that is mostly just wasted resources. It's not that it never helps. There are rare cases in which, yes, just thinking more and running more scenarios will continue. It's a point of diminishing returns, right? We run scenarios and think and analyze till we come to a conclusion. And yeah, we can think more and do better, but there's a point of diminishing returns. So my rule is once you come up with your idea to beat, you act on it unless you can identify one of 2 things or both. There's specific information that you don't have that if you had might change your idea. So in this scenario, it's maybe, I don't know how the other people dress at this new job. So let me figure that out first. And then depending on what I find there, it might reinforce my idea or it might change and be like, oh, no, it's not about how I dress, right? So specific information I don't have that I can get, if whether or not I know how to get it, that I can get, that could potentially change, beat the idea to beat. Or there's something I can do, an experience I can have that will give me new information, even if I'm not sure what that information is. So let me go to work dressed the way that I normally dress and pay attention. And that will open up. Let me borrow some clothes from a friend of mine and go dress that way and see if that affects how I experience the day. And then that might give me more information. And again, I know this is all arbitrary constructs because you could break it down in any way. But that's the other way that overthinking gets problematic.
I actually have a question. Can I ask a question real quick?
Yeah.
I've been holding on to it for the last 10 minutes. So I just want to get it out there. What are some ways to communicate to the people around you that you have anxiety, especially and particularly people that you're not super comfortable with? Like I'm very comfortable talking, with you guys, because I know you, but I'm comfortable talking with my boyfriend. I'm comfortable talking with my mom about that. But maybe like acquaintances that I have to interact with. How do I communicate when I'm having anxiety?
So you kind of clarified the question I was going to ask you there at the end, but I'm going to ask it anyway, just to demonstrate that earlier when you said when I have anxiety, that sometimes when people say have anxiety, what they mean is I am currently experiencing anxiety. There's something of which I'm aware in what I feel, what I think, what I perceive that I call anxiety. The other way that people sometimes use the term have anxiety is to say I have an anxiety disorder, or I have a predisposition to anxiety, or I get more anxious than I think the situation actually warrants, right? That it's I have anxiety as a condition, which means I am going to become anxious more frequently or more intensely than you might expect that I would. And it sounded like you clarified at the end that you meant the first, like when I'm experiencing anxiety.
Yeah. Like, and this person just said, like in a store, like, that social anxiety being like in a store.
You're in a store and the anxiety starts to occur.
Yeah.
Good. Sorry, I'm going to turn on my fan while I'm talking real quick. My forehead's getting shiny. This intense work. It's just, I know people like, oh, you sit around and talk all day. It's intense.
Yeah.
So there are limitations, unfortunately. And one of the ways to think about it is the more anxious you become, the less capable you become of navigating the situation. Meaning that eventually you get to a point where you're, theoretically a ball of panic and tears on the floor, right? And not even, barely even aware of your environment, much less being able to navigate it. So what we want to do, generally speaking, is try and set things up in advance or as early in that process as possible. So back to noticing that scale. Yeah, not able to think. Exactly. The more that you develop that scale, the more you can start to notice signs of you approaching that level at which you're not going to be able to think or navigate or communicate very well, and start to be able to do things ahead of time. Also, if you build correlations, you can start to predict and prepare for things before you experience any anxiety. Like if I know when I go to a store, half the time I experience anxiety, well, then there's a whole host of options that open up to me before I even go to the store and start to experience the anxiety. But you're talking about communication specifically, Sarah. What you want to do is build language with people. And some of that is verbal, but it doesn't all have to be verbal. That's why when we were talking about that 0 to 10 list, that I said, talk to people around you because they might notice things that you don't notice. That I know when my wife sighs in that certain way, my alarms go off and like, uh-oh, she's starting to get stressed. I need to pay attention. She may or may not be aware of that sigh, but I've noticed a correlation that seems to track, right? So incorporate them in that part, but then start constructing language that, and again, it doesn't have to be verbal language, just some means of communication where you attach a symbol to a meaning. That's all language means. So if you can have these conversations ahead of time when you're not anxious with people that you trust, like you said, your mom or your us or your boyfriend, that if I say I'm at a 4, that means do this or do that, or, try these options, or whatever language you want to use. But you were also talking about, what about people that I don't have either the opportunity to prepare and develop a shared language with ahead of time, or don't have the comfort level to let them in on that. And in that case, I would say that you're navigating that as best you already can, meaning with those constraints. For example, let's take it out to the extreme, right? Someone that I'm not comfortable communicating with at all. Well, if I'm not comfortable communicating with at all, then there's no way to communicate my anxiety to them. And obviously, that's the extreme level of that. But as we approach that, your ability to communicate, it does become decreased because options come off the table as far as what you're comfortable doing. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So not to say that there's no options, and you can explore things like practicing specific sentences ahead of time that will make it easier for you to say those things when the time comes. The more you practice a thing, the easier it becomes to do a thing. And the easier a thing is for you to do, the more you'll be able to do it even as your capacity to do things diminishes. In other words, if I were to try to build a house of cards, I would have to be in a place where I can really spend a lot of my resources focusing on that, and distractions would make it difficult. If I've done it a million times and I'm so good at building a house of cards, then I can be in a state where I'm worried and thinking about something else, but still build it. Mm. So you can practice those skills and you can come up with specific sentences. So,
like Tai Chi.
Probably, sure. Because again, I think Tai Chi would be more about managing yourself as opposed to communicating it to somebody.
Well, it's just like you do these things over and over in slow motion so that when the time comes, you don't think about it, you just do. And so you have that defensive response. So you go, I don't think.
That's like how I approach things with mindfulness, where, it comes like the specific meditations that I do, like come back to the breath. And so whenever I'm going to go into an audition, perform or have a difficult conversation, it's about coming back to your breath, even when you have other thoughts. And so by practicing that, it helps you can replace breath with something else, whether it's the other person's eyes or the point you're trying to make or the line that you're trying to say, and just helps you come back to that even when there's distractions.
Yeah, mindfulness are great coping skills. There's a lot of, meditation, movement meditations, breathing exercises are all wonderful coping skills. Coping skills meaning when I'm experiencing it, what are the things that bring me back down to zero? So as I'm building that list or dividing it into different types of anxieties, I put different coping skills in different places to make it easier for me to remember what thing to do when I'm experiencing that will help me. But with communication specifically, we're talking about what it is, what information you're conveying to another person. So you can do the same thing where you practice literally like, this might be a terrible example to use. I don't know if this makes me look bad, but I am terrified of rejection, right? That's always been true. It's not going away anytime soon. I get less anxious as I become more confident that I won't be rejected. The level of importance I place on not getting rejected isn't changing. I just do a lot to try and become more confident that it won't happen. So when I was younger and I was single and I was nervous about asking people out, one of the things I did is create a specific sentence to do it. I would say, I would love to take you to dinner sometime. And I can break down why I chose every word in that sentence, because I believe in putting my intentions out there and being clear and honest. I didn't want to leave myself a back door to say, like, if I said, hey, you want to hang out sometime? And they say no, I can be like, oh yeah, no, I just meant, like, as friends or whatever. If I said, I would love to take you dinner on Friday, and they say no, well, now I'm like, oh wait, are they just not available Friday, or was that their nice way of rejecting me? So I crafted that specific sentence, and it made it less anxiety inducing for me to be able to ask somebody out. So if you get anxious in the store frequently, again, you want to pay attention particularly to what it is about that. This is where the analysis comes in. Is it the fact that there's a lot of people around me? Is it that I don't know where everything in the store is, and so I start to get lost, and then I worry that people think that I'm lost? Is it that I just get overwhelmed by the sensation, whatever, and start to craft specific things that you can do, say, to communicate things to people in that moment? To say, okay, when I start to get that way, I'm going to go up to an employee. I'm going to find an employee and say, I'm looking for insert item here. Can you tell me can you lead me to where that is? Because I need them to lead me, as opposed to, can you tell me where that is? Because then they give me directions, but what if I'm not really hearing it, or forget, or misunderstand, right? Prepare yourself in practice instead of overthinking every possible thing that can happen for the worst. I like that comment. And yes, preparing yourself and practicing is increasing confidence. But it's good to know too that thinking, theoretically, hopefully, when it's working, is also increasing confidence. Running those scenarios can also increase confidence, and thinking can also bring down the importance. Meaning, back to the snake, I'm worried I'm going to get bitten and die, right? Well, I can do things to increase my confidence that I don't get bitten, or I can think it through and say, like, you know what? I know that if I get bitten, that what I'm supposed to do is not move, stay calm. So I have these exercises prepared that will help me slow my breathing so the poison doesn't spread. And I know that there's a hospital nearby that can, treat me. And I'm with somebody that if I say to them, hey, I just got bitten by a snake, they can get me to the car and to the hospital within 2 hours. And I know that it takes 4 hours to die. And so I'll be okay. Just getting that information, thinking through that, can say, okay, I still really don't want to get bitten, but it's a little less important than when it was like getting bitten equals death. If that makes sense.
So there's Douglas Adams wrote this really interesting book called Last Chance to See, which was back in the 80s when endangered species list first started coming out, and it was like a new thing. And there was this person who's an expert on, I think it was venomous creatures. And Douglas Adams was talking to him and said, like, oh, so what's your experience with them? He goes, oh, none, because like I know about them because I want to avoid them. I think that's why they're kind of the expert on that.
Well, I mean, this comes up all the time. Like, I had a client who was so terrified, as Kitchwatch mentioned in the chat, right, that people thought he was secretly a creep or an asshole, but just didn't say it to his face, right? Well, the more he's worried about that, for whatever reasons, whatever element of it's organic or trauma-based or whatever, he's worried about it. The more that he's worried about that, the more vigilant he becomes, right? The more resources he spends in watching out for any sign that could mean that somebody's finding him to be a creep or an asshole. So the more I'm worried about it, the less likely it becomes that it happens. Remember that everything that the brain and the body does, it does for a reason. Our brains and bodies evolved this way because those things helped. But sometimes there's glitches, and sometimes there's scenarios and contexts that we're in that our brains and bodies were not evolved for, and things are different, so we want to change. But there's always at least some circumstances in which that would be helpful. And the truth is that in any given person's life, even in our modern context, most of the time this stuff works. That's why your brain keeps doing it. Most of the time, thinking through a problem does help you solve it. But when it doesn't is when it starts to escalate into this. And those are the instances we're talking about here, because the ones in which thinking about it solve the problem, you don't even remember it. It worked. The problem was gone. So it's not to say that thinking isn't helpful. It is. It's to notice the times when thinking has fallen short. It hasn't helped you. And then what do I got to do? There's no such thing as a globally good or bad trait, a globally good or bad exercise, idea, skill. Everything about being human is advantageous in some contexts, disadvantageous in other contexts, and value neutral in many. I do want to talk, though, because we labeled this about coping is good, prevention is better, but we've mostly been talking about coping. So I want to switch over to preventing yourself from getting into anxiety. And I know that approaching scale is one way, but even that you have to be a little aware. Do we have a question about making it so that I don't get anxious in the future, or I get anxious less frequently or less intensely? And if not, I'll just talk about it.
Like, I have questions myself, but like one of the things, so you talked a bit about like having the confidence and like building that confidence so you know what to do, through rehearsal and all that stuff. Like, what are some like skills that you can do to help that? Because confidence to me sounds a lot like anxiety, where it's just like a catch-all. It also seems like magic, where like, oh, it's there, I'll just not be able to access it because.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I appreciate you saying that, because confidence is one of those words. So I want to be clear that I'm not talking about confidence as in some personality trait of I'm able to put myself out there or whatever that people sometimes use it. What I mean is my belief about how likely it is that this thing will happen. So in other words, if it's very important to me that this thing happens, I'm running my numbers. I'm going to put numbers on it, even though in real life, it's not about numbers, but just to make it something we can look at. I'm running the scenarios in my head, and I'm saying there's a 70% chance that it's going to go the way that I want it to go, and a 30% chance that it won't. So I would call that then 70% confident. It's not about how I carry myself or how I speak or communicate or even how I think about or value myself. It's about my assessment of this thing that is worrying me, this thing that is making me anxious, that I think is important. My assessment of how likely or unlikely is it that it will go the way that I want it to go. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Does that clarify from confidence?
Yeah. I mean, so I get a little like, if this seems off, let me know. Like, so I'm having a hard time seeing the difference between like overthinking it and like building confidence, because to me, when I'm thinking about like doing anything, it's just like I'll start to go through all these scenarios, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, there's this. I got to plan for all this. I got to practice for all this, and all of a sudden like I'm stuck in that to where I avoid it. Like I think about like one of the questions we had was for me was like responding to like friends' text or emails and stuff, and like work it's easier, but like friends and stuff it's very difficult for me because I don't have the time there or whatever. So I think of 1,000 scenarios. So how does that help? Like, how do I shift from like building confidence versus like just overthinking and going down that rabbit trail? And
well, so like we've been talking about, overthinking versus thinking, in a valuable way, is a subjective determination, just like severe anxiety or not. But as a general rule, what I would say, when you get into overthinking, I define that as I'm spending a lot of my resources on thinking about a thing, and the return that I'm getting on that, even if thinking through the scenarios is making me feel better about it, the rate at which it's making me feel better is not worth what I'm putting into it. How much it's dominating my time and working memory and attention and all that. But as far as what to do about it, that first exercise we talked about, where I can rank, label how important is it and how confident, and then I ask the question, and let's take it away from confidence. Let's say how likely I believe it is that it will go that way, right? That I can then ask the question, what can I do that will make it more likely that it goes the way that I want it to go? And yeah, sometimes you may come up with nothing. There's nothing I can do. It's just going to be scary. And other times you're going to come up with things. Well, if I practice right now doing this subset of the skill that's involved in doing that task, then that makes it more likely that it'll go the way that I want to go, right? And real quickly, and I can say it real fast because we're recording this and people can go back and watch it more slowly, that one exercise I like to do is break tasks down, events down into their sub skills that build up into it, so that I can practice a skill that increases my belief in the likelihood of it going the way that I want to go. And I do use a sports metaphor here, but not one that I'm really intimately familiar with. But think of, basketball players don't prepare to play a basketball game only by playing basketball games. There are many different things that they do, some of which are easier or more accessible to do under other contexts than just playing a full basketball game, right? So we can break it down the same way. I talk about skills practice, which means take some skill involved in it and practice that. So in the basketball metaphor, I can do passing drills and shooting drills and dribbling drills, right? We can do table work, which is where I'm not physically engaging in any of the skill, but I'm doing research and learning things. So in the metaphor, this is when I'm like learning plays, right? Preparing and coming up and designing and thinking about, if I move here and he moves there, then the opponent will try to defend this way, and that opens up this. I can do analysis, where I watch film of myself from the last game or film of my opponents from previous games, so that I get more information to make guesses about what might happen, or if I change this thing, then I can do that thing differently. And then I talk about conditioning, which is, the equivalent of working out. That even though me getting my body into better shape is not directly correlated with any specific skill in playing a basketball game, the better shape I'm in, the more I will be able to do those things at lower resource costs, percentage-wise. So we can break those things down and practice any particular one of those things, get more knowledge. Remember those two things we talked about for specific knowledge that will potentially make me feel better about my choice, make it feel more likely, and how I go get that, or a specific experience that will get me new information, even if I don't know what it is. And there's only two ways to get new information. One is to experience a thing. I'm going to go real fast because we've got 3 minutes left. The other is to get it from somebody else, whether that's through a book or for a friend or an expert or whatever. So we, ask that initial question of what are the things I can do that makes it more likely. And here's the other one that I like people to think about. I call odds and stakes. People tend to overfocus on the odds and not on the stakes as much. Meaning, if you give me 51% odds that I win $1 and 49% odds that I lose $1, then I will take that every single time, because over time I'll win more than I lose. If you give me 51% odds that I win $1 and 49% odds that I lose $2, it's now no longer a good bet for me, right? So I might assess intellectually, I might know 99.99999% chance that this goes exactly the way I want it, and I have a really fun evening with these strangers that I've never met before. But there's that 0.00001% chance, and intellectually I know it's not likely, but the chance there is that I experience rejection, and rejection for me is so brutal that it just knocks me out for 2 weeks and I question everything about myself. Then I might still say, I'm not taking that bet. And that's okay. And that's self-care. It's not avoidance. It's not cowardice. It's saying, listen, you and I might agree on the odds, friend who's telling me, hey, it's going to be fine. It's going to be fun. Don't worry. Nobody's going to make fun of you or anything like that. You and I might both agree that's the most likely scenario. But you may not understand, friend, that unlikely scenario, which to you is like, yeah, that would suck, to me is like, no, I would die. So I'm not taking that bet. And again, I like to be exaggerated in my examples just to make things clear. You can offer me, 999,999,999 out of a billion odds that I will win $10 billion. And that 1 out of a billion is that I will have to kill my firstborn son. Not taking that bet. I don't care. I'm good. $10 billion sounds nice. Not worth a 1 in a billion risk of that other thing. So understand the stakes and the odds. And then you can manipulate both of those things.
Which I know we're out of time. We got a really good question in.
Tell me, I'll do it fast.
Okay, it's pretty big, but it kind of goes with this.
How can you cope with anxiety about something that's ever present or something that you can't directly control? This is a really great question. I'm going to do it super fast. And it's something that maybe we should do again next week. We can revisit it to get into more nuance, but I want to give you something right now. So control, as with everything in the human experience, is not a binary. It's simple to think of it as a binary, but it is not actually binary. It is a spectrum, meaning with what is within my capability, in my power to do, I define power as my ability to influence the environment around me, to shape it the way I want it to be shaped. The more I have, the greater my ability to do that, right? If I am aware of something, then that thing falls somewhere on that spectrum. If I am aware of a thing and have analyzed that it's a thing I don't like, it falls somewhere on that spectrum. And for all practical purposes, many things fall so far down that line of the spectrum of my ability to influence is so minute that I don't believe that it's really worth me putting in those efforts as far as the likelihood that it will result in any kind of significant change. but it's there. And remember that the problem is about your awareness, not about reality. So this is not I'm not proposing this as a solution, but just pointing out this possibility that to be unaware of a thing that bothers you and which you don't have control over is one way to stop feeling anxiety over that thing. You have to be aware of it and not like it in order to feel the anxiety. So climate change and mass shootings, yes, absolutely. And in particular, that second one that is very much in our consciousness collectively right now. And I myself have experienced like, okay, I'm going to this concert and I'm a little worried that there's going to be, again, not super worried, a little bit, but it's big stakes, so it's making me anxious. And I may end up avoiding it and not going, or I may circle back around to the same exercises before. What are the things that I can do that increase my belief that it's likely that I will come out of that unscathed, right? And I know this is one particular part of anxiety because it might be anxious about not me getting shot, but just the fact that it exists and other people are getting hurt. We talk about a strong sense of fairness or justice that a lot of people have where they get very wounded by the idea of a thing happening to other people, but it's still something of which you have to be aware. And if you're aware of it, it falls somewhere. So sometimes practically speaking, yeah, you don't have control, even though technically you can talk about it. For example, learning more about climate change and talking more about climate change, it's hard to draw a direct line from that to I've solved climate change. But if you look at the odds, look at the stakes, it might be infinitesimally small, but talking about it with people makes it more likely that it will go the way that you want it to go. Learning more about it increases your ability to both talk about it with other people, as well as potentially come up with new solutions that you don't have the knowledge or experience right now to be aware of, but could eventually come up with. In other words, if whoever invented a way to, make something that burns, give me an example of a real environmental thing. I'm blanking on like an actual environmental, like climate change development.
Like talk about deforestation, for instance, of burning lots of land for agriculture.
Right. What's something that somebody invented that made that better? Norman Borlaug. That's the one I can come up with. The dwarf wheat, right?
Okay.
Food crisis, projections of millions of people dying from starvation and famine, and he develops a new type of wheat that, for whatever reason that I don't understand because it's not my field, allows them to make more with less resources and people are fed. Until he was able to do that, he didn't know that he could do that. But he started down some path, right? I care about this, so I'm going to go to college and study agriculture and biology. And during that, I'm going to learn new things. And then I'm going to try this project and that project. And even though each of those things, each step of the way is like, is this going to solve world hunger, me going to study biology at college? No. But it leads down a path that potentially opens up things later on down the line where you can do something. Usually anxiety, it comes back to, again, that difference. And even if the change that we have, it's about opportunity and opportunity cost. If I'm looking at every option that I can possibly be aware of, then I can still select the option that increases the chances the most, even if that's repeating zeros forever, 1% as opposed to 0. I can choose that, and that gets me closer and closer. Otherwise, you were doing a lot of coping. And we'll talk more about this next week.
We should probably do a continuation of this because there's a lot. As we're seeing, anxiety is a big catch-all.
Anxiety too.
Yeah.
I am glad to be with you all.
Yay.
I'm going to drop Cecil and Sarah if you will finish it out. Thank you all for being here and for your questions. I will talk to you all next week.
So that's us for thank you for joining us this week. We're Effective Artistry. We will continue this discussion next week in Anxiety Part 2. Even more anxiety. It's what everyone looks forward to. Find us at Twitter and Instagram at EF_artistry. Our website is effectiveartistry.com. If you have any questions, comments, anything else, feel free to contact us. You can contact us through our website. The whole thing there. So I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and thank you guys for joining us, and see you guys next week.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.